to welcome you all for our keynote address here, and it's also a great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker here, Dr. SherAli Tareen, and I would like to express my gratitude, our gratitude on the behalf of the Institute of Islamic Studies for agreeing to come here and speak to us. Dr. SherAli Tareen is an associate professor of religious studies at Franklin and Marshall College. His work centers on Muslim intellectual thought in early modern and modern South Asia, with a focus on intra-Muslim debates and polemics on crucial questions of law, ethics, and theology. His book, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, is forthcoming this November as a paperback from University of Notre Press. He is also interested in the intersection of secularism and Muslim intellectual thought, and co-hosts a popular podcast, New Books in Islamic Studies. So I'll hand it over to you, Professor Tareen.
Thank you so much, Akshay. It's such an honor and pleasure and privilege to be here. Thank you to all the organizers, Zahra, Aksa, Sam, Zulekha, Dr. Michelle Hartman, and all faculty at this institute, and to all of you for being here. It has been so energizing to learn from the work of graduate students gathered here. It's really been an honor and pleasure. I've prepared some comments to stay within my limit of 40 to 42 minutes or so. And there is a handout which has been circulated which has some terms. I will point it out to you or indicate when they come up in the course of my talk. This is an extract, a small fragment of a forthcoming monograph, Defending Muhammad in Modernity. The central question I will explore today is this: how do conditions of colonial modernity generate debates on the boundaries of tradition among the colonized? I will do so by examining some fragments of what is arguably the longest running and most contentious and complicated intra-Muslim polemical battles in the history of South Asian Islam, called the Barelvi-Deobandi polemic. With beginnings in late 19th century North India, the Barelvi-Deobandi polemic brought into view an ethical conundrum that has captured the imagination of Muslims for several centuries. How should a community honor the Prophet's memory and normative example? Almost 200 years separate the beginnings of this polemic from the present. However, the Barelvi-Deobandi polemic remains one of the most abrasive and intensely fought-out polemical battles in the history of South Asian Islam. One that continues until today not only in post-colonial South Asia, but indeed all over the world in diaspora South Asian Muslim communities in places such as the UK, the US, South Africa, and the Caribbean. In both contemporary India and Pakistan, the stakes and arguments of this polemic permeate not only Muslim institutions of learning, but also sites of everyday life, such as neighborhoods, mosques, and public libraries. Indeed, rather than showing any signs of abating, this polemic has literally gone viral, as today it is most intensely fought out in online chat rooms and forums populated by users all over the world. The logics, archives, and terrain of this polemic have indelibly informed the critical question of what counts as Islam and a normative Muslim identity in the modern world, in South Asia, and indeed globally. My talk today will focus on this polemic. What was it about? What was at stake? And what are the competing understandings of tradition and reform that it brought into view? Through this exercise, I will try to do two things. One, provide a specific illustration of how the boundaries of the Muslim tradition are contested in conditions of modernity. So what sorts of intra-Muslim debates and contestations emerge as Muslim scholars contend with the conditions and conundrums of colonial modernity. And two, raise some larger conceptual questions regarding the study of Muslim reform that are applicable not only to modern South Asia, but to global Islam more generally. Before going any further, let me very briefly explain what these terms, Barelvi and Deobandi, refer to, that I will be frequently mentioning in the course of my talk. The words Deobandi and Barelvi refer to two major Muslim reform movements / normative orientations that emerged in late 19th century Northern India, but that today have become global transnational movements, especially Deoband. The words Barelvi and Deobandi are derived from the names of two towns in the province of Uttar Pradesh in North India, Bareilly and Deoband, where the founding pioneers of these two movements were from. In addition to representing major reform movements, Deobandi and Barelvi also refer to two global networks of Islamic seminaries, or madrasas, that are dotted all over South Asia and among the South Asian diaspora around the world. The pioneers of these movements, a couple of whom you will meet in the course of my comments today, were among the most prolific, widely followed, and contentious figures in modern South Asian Islam, who were both prominent jurists from the Hanafi school of law and major Sufi masters, and who were fluent in and wrote interchangeably in Arabic, Persian, and Urdu. A brief word on context. Why did such reform movements emerge in late 19th century South Asia? So in 1857, as many of us know, there was a mutiny or a war of rebellion in which Indian Muslims were brutally defeated by the British, and that effectively ended Muslim political sovereignty in India. But paradoxically, the loss of political sovereignty led to an ever greater intensification and fermentation of intellectual thought, as Indian Muslim scholars wrestled with the question of how one must reform Islam and Muslims in these new conditions of colonialism, when Muslims had now been colonized by a foreign power, the British. But while different Muslim scholars desired and were invested in reforming Islam, what reform meant to them varied considerably, generating tremendous debate, disagreement, and indeed polemics. These reform movements as much responded to the anxieties generated by a newly emergent colonial public sphere as they were the beneficiaries of such a public sphere, marked by new technologies like print, the railways, and the postal system, and defined by the political and epistemological reordering of religion as an increasingly reified and competitive category. Indeed, while there was nothing new about ferocious intra-Muslim polemics on questions of law, theology, and ritual practice in South Asia, what was completely new and unprecedented about the late 19th century, in addition to the sheer volume and intensity of these polemics, was their group-centered nature. In the pre-colonial moment, intra-Muslim intellectual debates were largely staged between competing individual scholars, whereas such conflicts took on a much more defined group-centered identity by the late 19th century. One more clarifying comment and then we'll be good to go. This is not a sectarian polemic between Sunnis and Shia. Both Deobandis and Barelvis are Sunni groups. Both Deobandis and Barelvis were deeply invested in Hanafi law and in Sufism. Where they differed from one another was on the question of what it meant to be a Sunni Hanafi Muslim under conditions of colonialism. Indeed, it was precisely because these two groups were so similar in their broad outlines and in the potential clientele they sought to attract that their polemics were often so personal and caustic. Let me now state at the outset what the point of this talk is and what is the broader conceptual argument that I would like you to take away from this talk. Today, in both academic and non-academic venues, the Barelvi-Deobandi polemic is most commonly approached as the manifestation of a perennial conflict between legal and mystical varieties of Islam, or between Islamic law and Sufism. Scholars who oppose ritual practices like, say, the annual celebration of the Prophet's birthday, or commemorating the death anniversaries of saints, are often viewed as banner bearers of harsh legalism or the Sharia. This stereotype is most commonly attached to the Deoband school. On the other hand, those who defend such practices, like the Barelvis, are categorized as the soft, peaceful Sufis. Now, this law-Sufism binary is intimately connected to a larger 19th century colonial Orientalist and today an insidious new imperial liberal secular narrative of the good Muslim, bad Muslim, whereby goodness is measured in terms of proximity to a modern Western understanding of what counts as authentic religion, and often in terms of what is most conducive to US foreign policy at a given moment. So, for instance, in a widely circulated and influential 2003 publication of the Washington, D.C. think tank, the RAND Corporation, titled Civil Democratic Islam, Partners, Resources and Strategies, it was recommended that, and here I quote from the report, the threat of Sharia-driven extremists in Pakistan, as represented by the Deobandis, should be neutralized by bolstering the position of moderate Sufi religious leaders like the Barelvis, through financial and other assistance to a wide range of their activities. End of quote. A similar recommendation was advanced in another report published in 2009, 6 years later, by the influential think tank, the Heritage Foundation. While the most coarse and pernicious expressions are found in policy documents of neo-imperial US think tanks, traces of this and other such moderating binaries can also be found in many instances of otherwise serious academic scholarship on Islam and South Asia. Paucity of time will not allow me to go into specific examples, but the larger point is this. In such framings, undergirding the good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative, the projection of Sufism as moderate or good Islam is enacted on the grounds of its inherent opposition to the Sharia or Islamic law that is charged with carrying the threatening contagion of extremism. Such a packaging of Sufism as the peaceful variety of Islam at odds with the Islamic legal tradition, as we all know, represents a gross caricature of both Islamic law and that of Sufism. In today's talk, as a way to substantively move away from the law-Sufism binary, I want to propose a conceptual framework that instead focuses on the question of how authoritative Indian Muslim scholars imagined the idea of divine sovereignty during a moment when Muslim political sovereignty was threatened and eventually eroded by colonial power. My main argument today is that the Barelvi-Deobandi polemic was animated by what I call competing political theologies. By political theology, I mean the intimate interlocking of theological discourses and political and social imaginaries. At the heart of this polemic was the question of how one should imagine divine sovereignty and its relationship to Prophet Muhammad's authority during the colonial moment when Indian Muslims had lost their political sovereignty. Let me very briefly situate my intervention in the study of religion. In religious studies, following the seminal work of German theorist Carl Schmitt and most recently that of the Italian philosopher Agamben, political theology is a category that has been mobilized in singularly helpful and interesting ways to interrogate the theological foundations of modern secular politics and the liberal state, as captured in Schmitt's famous argument that, and here I'm quoting from his famous political theology, all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts, end of quote. Now, I'm indebted to this scholarship and engage it fulsomely in my work. But in this project, I invert the problem space of the field of political theology by interrogating not the theological underpinning of secular politics and the modern state, but by asking the question of how shifting political conditions inform theological debates and discourses, especially during hinge moments like the transition from the Mughal to the British Empire in India. More specifically, a major theme of my talk gravitates around the question of how the loss of political sovereignty generates conditions that intensify debates over divine sovereignty and its interaction with the everyday life of a community. With the onset of British colonialism, as centuries of Muslim rule over large parts of the Indian subcontinent came to an end, nothing seemed more urgent to the Muslim scholarly elite than securing the boundaries of faith from the threat of internal and external others. So I will argue that at stake in the Barelvi-Deobandi polemic was the question of how one should understand the encounter between God, the Prophet, and the community during a moment of immense moral and political anxiety. It is this nexus between theology, law, and everyday practice that represents the conceptual thread binding this talk, and that I propose as a way to interrogate intra-Muslim traditions of debate and argument. So to begin with an obvious question, what was at the heart of this intra-Muslim polemic that to this day fuels intense fury and passionate debate? Among other things, the Deobandi-Barelvi polemic was driven in large measure by a fundamental ethical question that has captured the imagination of Muslim thinkers for several centuries. What are the limits of innovation to the normative model of the Prophet and his companions? In other words, when does innovation in religion become heresy? Or to phrase it yet differently, what is the scope and etiquette governing the application of the doctrine of what is called heretical innovation, bid'ah, in Islam? Heretical innovation or bid'ah is at once one of the most controversial and among the most elusive and subtle categories in Muslim thought. The intellectual genealogy of bid'ah is traceable to two well-known sayings of Prophet Muhammad which read, "Every innovation is a misguidance and every misguidance leads to hell." And whoever innovates in this matter of ours, that which is not a part of it is rejected. In a nutshell, bid'ah, heretical innovation, represents the inverse of sunnah, the normative model or the normative practice of the Prophet, one of the two most authoritative sources in Islam along with the Quran. While Sunnah signifies normative practices that bind the community to a shared history and tradition, Bid'ah or heretical innovation represents unsanctioned new habits and practices that oppose the Sunnah. Now, Bid'ah is, in many ways, is a paradoxical concept, as it announces simultaneously the limits of tradition and the always imminent threat and possibility of transgressing those limits. Limits and transgression, as Michel Foucault memorably asserted, are mutually entangled and constitutive. Each is the other's condition of possibility. As he instructively put it, and I quote, "The limit and transgression depend on each other for whatever density of being they possess. A limit could not exist if it were absolutely uncrossable, and reciprocally, transgression would be pointless if it merely crossed a limit composed of illusions and shadows." End of quote. Foucault's words here capture the conceptual complications shadowing bid'ah as an index of transgression in Islam. Committing bid'ah means transgressing the limits of the Prophet's normative model, the Sunnah. But precisely the threat and the actuality of transgression give life to those limits. Sunnah and bid'ah, the normative and the heretical, the limits of tradition and the transgression of those limits are intimately interwoven and mutually dependent. Heretical innovation, of course, does not refer to all innovations that came after the Prophet's life. So innovations such as new technologies like railways or telephones, or the development of Arabic grammar as a discipline that happens much after the Prophet's life, are completely fine. Why? Because they are either unrelated to religion or they don't oppose religion. Heretical innovation only refers to innovations in religion that oppose religion and the prophetic norm. But as we will see, determining what counts as innovation in religion that opposes religion is a complicated matter that often hinges on what one means by religion itself. At stake in how one imagines the parameters of bid'ah are the very boundaries, and by extension the very content of Islam as a discursive tradition. Indeed, the question of when innovation turns into heresy equates to asking what defines Islam and its limits. Deobandi and Barelvi scholars answer this fundamental question in radically contrasting ways. Let me first explain the Deobandi position. The centerpiece of the Deobandi reform project hovered around the desire and anxiety to protect the absoluteness of divine sovereignty by emphasizing the humanity of the Prophet. For example, in the view of Deobandi scholars, calling the Prophet one's brother would not amount to offensive or disrespectful speech or conduct. On the contrary, such an affirmation of the Prophet's human qualities was to be encouraged. The well-known prophetic saying, "I am unlike any of you, lastu ka ahadan minkum," only referred to Muhammad's unique status as a recipient of divine revelation, the Deobandis argued. In all other matters of human existence, he was much like anyone else. Deobandi scholars often try to authorize their emphasis on the Prophet's humanity by pointing to the proclamation uttered by all Muslims during the 5 daily prayers. "I bear witness that there is no God except God, and that Muhammad is his servant and his messenger." What must be noticed in this proclamation, they often reminded the readers, was that the affirmation of Muhammad's servitude to God preceded the mention of his role as a messenger. Therefore, the Prophet's position as God's servant, Abduhu, took priority over his status as God's messenger, Rasuluhu. The Prophet's humanity was a defining aspect of his persona. Now, consistent with this larger reformist mission, eager to secure divine sovereignty from the threat of any competitors, especially the prophetic competitor, Deobandi discourses on bid'ah or heretical innovation were also driven by a psychology of unceasing rivalry between human and divine norms. As an illustration, let me turn to the thought of arguably the most prolific and influential modern South Asian Muslim scholar, the Deoband scholar SherAli Tareen, died 1944. From the village of Thana Bhawan in North India, hence his name was Thanvi. Thanvi was a polymath scholar who excelled in and left an indelible mark on almost all disciplines in the Muslim humanities, including law, Sufism, Quran, commentaries, and philosophy. Now, Thanvi defined heretical innovation, and here I quote him, as an innovated practice in religion that simulates the Sharia in the intensity and discipline with which it is undertaken. End of quote. Let me explain Thanvi's definition of bid'ah a bit further. Thanvi argued that any pattern of repeated activity begins threatening the legislative authority of the prophetic norm, the Sunnah, when it is performed with the same degree of passion, commitment, and discipline reserved exclusively for normatively obligatory acts of religion, such as praying, fasting, or any other act intended to attain greater proximity to God. Now the term for such a repetitive ritual practice or custom was a critical component of the Deobandi discourses of bid'ah. Let me briefly explain what it means. The category of rasam, plural rusum, of course, is derived from the Arabic roots rasama, literally meaning to imprint, draw, or sketch a pattern. In its Urdu modality, rasam can best be rendered as customs and habits that through a process of repetitive performance become an entrenched part of a community's everyday life. Now, this category of rasam goes through a curious transformation in the intellectual history of South Asian Islam, such that by the late 19th century, it is almost seen as a synonym for bid'ah or heretical innovation in Muslim reformist discourses. The modality of this shift is usefully captured if one attends to the discussion of this category by the iconic 18th century scholar Shah Waliullah in his magisterial magnum opus in Arabic, God's Conclusive Argument, Hujjatullah al-Baligha. In a fascinating section of this text entitled Dominant Customs and Conventions Among the People, Rusum Asa'ira fi Nas, Waliullah argued that habits and customs, or rusum, were, and here I quote him, and this is at the bottom of the first page of her handout, rusum were among the instruments of moral cultivation that are as critical to the moral functioning and advancement of a community as the heart is to the body. الرسوم من الارتفاقات هي بمنزلة القلب من جسد الإنسان وإياها قصدت الشرائع أولا وبالذات. For Waliullah then, customs or rusum represented instruments of moral cultivation that were corrupted by the morally sluggish political elite, unable to see or understand the broader interests, al-masali al-kulliya, of a community rose to power. Thus, while rusum were vulnerable to corruption, he also had a notion of reform and moral corruption. But such corruption emanated from moral cracks in the political economy and leadership driving a community. The focus of Waliullah's thought thus was on the interaction of cosmology, politics, and the moral fashioning of everyday life. But curiously, if we look at the Urdu translation of Hujjatullah al-Baligha by the famous contemporary Deoband scholar Saeed Ahmad Palanpuri, titled God's Capacious Mercy, Rahmatullah al-Wasi'ah, we find that while translating the section from Waliullah's text that I just quoted, he employed the phrase customs and heretical innovations, rusum wa bid'at, as a tautological compound, as if they were synonymous. This despite the fact that in this particular section, Waliullah never even used the term bid'ah, either independently of or with reference to the category of rusum or customs. Yet in the late 20th century, a scholar like Palanpuri took the equation of these terms as almost a given. This presumed synonymity of rusum and bid'ah had a lot to do with the thought and intellectual impact of prominent 19th century South Asian Muslim reformers like the Deoband pioneer SherAli Tareen. Let me explain this point by elaborating a bit further the Deobandi contribution to this discussion. In Deobandi thought, the defining quality of a heretical innovation was that the communal insistence, the peer pressure, if you will, to participate in such a practice had reached a level that anyone who voluntarily abstained from it was severely ridiculed. Such conventions were kept alive and perpetuated by the invisible pressure of communal expectations and norms rather than by adherence to the dictates of divine law. Ashraf Ali Thanvi's definition of rasam or custom illustrates this point very well. He defined rasam as, and here I quote him from your handout, a non-obligatory practice that becomes so deeply ritualized in a community that anyone who abandons it becomes a target of his community's rebuke and censure. Moreover, conformity to the habits of one's ancestors or the peer pressure of friends, relatives, and community members represents the foundational source for the popularity that such rituals achieve. Let me give an example of such a ritual. An excellent example of such a ritual was arguably the most contested ritual of 19th century Muslim scholarly South Asia, the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, or the Mawlid as it is popularly called. Popularized first in Fatimid Egypt during the 11th century, today the Mawlid is widely performed in almost all Muslim communities. While this is a devotional ritual meant to honor the Prophet, it is a ritual that came into Muslim life in the 11th century, much after the Prophet's death. So it is an innovation, but is it, or could it ever be, a heretical innovation? In essence now, Deobandi scholars unabashedly admitted The celebration of the Prophet's birthday or the Maulid was not only permissible but also a commendable practice. This was so because this practice served as a means to honor and venerate the Prophet. But in the view of Deoband scholars, this otherwise commendable practice had become terminally corrupted. Why? Because of the attitude with which the masses engaged in this practice. Let me explain his position. As we know, the Sharia practices are primarily categorized as obligatory, forbidden, or as neither obligatory nor forbidden, but as simply permissible. Now, according to the Sharia then, the Maulid is a simply permissible practice that is not obligatory on anyone. However, Deoband scholars argued that Indian Muslims participated in this practice with such intensity, discipline, and rigor as if it were obligatory, thus simulating the Sharia. They had turned into an obligation that which was not obligatory. Iltizam wa la yalzim. But how would one know that the masses have turned a non-obligatory practice into an obligation? According to Thanvi, what confirmed this was the fact that anyone who voluntarily abstained from such a ritual became vulnerable to the collective censure and repudiation of his community. According to the Deobandi narrative, by elevating into an obligation a ritual that God had not obligated in the Sharia, Indian Muslims were compromising and challenging God's legislative sovereignty. So the centerpiece of the Deobandi reform project was to protect the primacy of religious obligations against the threat of seemingly pious, this is a crucial point here, seemingly pious and spiritually rewarding rituals that are simply permissible, mubah, according to the Sharia, but that the masses have turned into obligations. The Deoband pioneers feared that the masses may easily confuse voluntary acts of piety as obligatory acts. For instance, Thanvi likened such voluntary rituals to tempting sweets, mithai, that make young gullible kids salivate. While mesmerizingly pleasurable when ingested, these sweets can only harm the health of the young in earnest in the long run. The main point I want to emphasize from this discussion then is this. In Deobandi discourses on bid'ah, law and theology were inextricably intertwined. The legal prohibition against human innovations in ritual practices was anchored in a larger theological imaginary, eager to guard the primacy of divine sovereignty. Notice that central to the conceptual architecture of bid'ah is the capacity of the human subject to cultivate a parallel order of normativity, a faux Sharia, that might rival God's authority as a sovereign legislator. Indeed, it is this fundamental sin of choosing which constitutes hierasis, heresy. So a quick recap of Thanvi's position. The Maulid is a practice that God has willed to be permissible, but that the masses have turned into an obligation, thus they challenge God's law and hence his sovereignty. But an important question that arises here is this. How does this happen? How do non-obligatory rituals assume the aura of obligations? What is the reason for and the process through which the masses come to perform a non-obligatory practice with such dedication and regularity as if it were obligatory? Thanvi's answers to these questions come to us through a fascinating discussion of his on another intensely contested ritual in South Asia, the ritual of transmitting blessings to the deceased by distributing food among family and community members, especially the destitute among them. Almost ubiquitous among South Asian Muslims even today, this ritual is also known as a Fatiha, since participants often recite the opening chapter of the Quran, the Fatiha, over the food, and the blessings received from this act of charity then are transmitted to the souls of the deceased, who could be relatives, friends, or prominent scholars and saints. The Fatiha, which is what I will call this ritual henceforth, is usually undertaken on the 3rd or 40th day of a person's death. Hence, this event is also called the 3rd or the 40th, Sivam or Chaliswa. The size and scope of these events can vary from a gathering of a few households in a neighborhood to massive crowds encompassing whole villages and towns. Despite the widespread popularity of the Fatiha, Thanvi considered this practice a heretical innovation that had been terminally corrupted by the manner and intention with which it was performed. Let me briefly walk you through his explanation. Thanvi protested that in his day, Indian Muslims were so compulsively attached to certain specific modes of performing this ritual that its original purpose and reasoning, that of charity, was completely lost on them. In his view, the ritual had become a mere convention, a mere rasam, divested of its original purpose and objective. Why? Because, Thanvi argued, such popular rituals only ostensibly fulfilled devotional purposes, when in fact they only served as a means to show off wealth and conform to the pressures of the community. In order to test the true motivation of the organizers for hosting this event, Thanvi proposed an interesting experiment. He suggested that the organizers of this event should be members of their community, the Baradari. Instead, they should privately give charity to someone destitute or donate funds to a mosque or a seminary, a madrasa. After all, the more needy and desperate the recipients of charity, the more rewards and blessings will it bring to the deceased, since the more rewards the living will actually be earning. If presented with the suggestion Thanvi predicted, the inevitable reply will be something to the effect of, "Good Lord, subhanallah. Do you really expect us to spend our money without anyone even hearing about it? How can we let that happen?" For Thanvi, this condition defeated the entire logic of transmitting rewards to the deceased, since the very intentionality underlying such rituals was corrupt and founded on affectation. The living were not even earning any blessings or rewards that could then be passed on. As he sarcastically put it, and I quote, "When the balance in this world is zero, what is left to be gifted to the deceased? Jab yahan hi sifar hai to wahan kya bakshoge?" Now, conceptually most important to note here is the pivotal role of history in Thanvi's narrative of how rituals become ritualized. History, he argues, authorizes rituals in ways that make it impossible to unauthorize them. For example, in Thanvi's view, the original purpose of offering food as a means of transmitting blessings to the deceased had become buried in time and history. The original purpose of this ritual was invisible. It was hidden by history and time. Its original purpose was hidden by time because, as one might say, it had been there for some time. So the point is this. Central to the reform project of Thanvi and his Deobandi colleagues was an understanding of the present as having been corrupted by time and history. And they saw their own role as reformers tasked with the mission of awakening the masses from the miasmic slumber of time so that religion could be performed more aware and more self-conscious of divine law and its prescribed boundaries. Let me shift in the remainder of my time to the opposing school of thought, the Barelvi school, to see how they countered this normative project. The Barelvi conception of reform differed dramatically from that of their Deobandi rivals. The Barelvi assault on Deobandi thought was led by the founder of the school, Ahmad Raza Khan, died 1921. Khan was a preeminent jurist and Sufi master who wrote prolifically on a variety of subjects including law, theology, Sufism and philosophy. His texts number close to 1,000. Now, the defining feature of the Barelvi understanding of tradition was the active veneration of the Prophet in contrast with the Deobandi understanding. The active veneration of the Prophet as the most exalted of all beings. For Ahmad Raza Khan and his Barelvi followers, honoring the Prophet's status as God's most beloved subject represented a non-negotiable doctrinal imperative. Anyone who even hinted at puncturing the aura of Muhammad's nobility had to be confronted, repudiated, and deposed of his credibility. Khan's passion for guarding the sacrality of Muhammad's charisma was intimately connected to a larger political imaginary, driven by an uncompromisingly hierarchical worldview. Indeed, a hierarchical vision of both the social and religious orders was one of the hallmarks of the Barelvi conception of tradition. The human-divine relationship could only be sustained with the mediating authority of saints and the Prophet. Moreover, each entity occupied a successively advanced station in the hierarchy of salvific activity, with the Prophet positioned at the pinnacle of this hierarchy. Therefore, consistent with this theology, Ahmad Raza Khan lambasted Deoband scholars for outlawing rituals that served as a means to honor the Prophet's memory and example, such as his birthday celebration. He chastised them for cultivating a public sphere in which the exaltation of the Prophet and the pious ancestors was almost criminalized. Crucially, Khan's argument was grounded in the protocols and procedures of Islamic legal reasoning, not in some recourse to mystical moderation. Hermeneutically, he argued that unless a practice was explicitly forbidden in the Sharia, it was permissible. The default value of all practices that had not been explicitly forbidden by the Sharia was that of permissibility. Put more simply, all non-forbidden practices were essentially permissible. In explaining this legal principle, Khan cited the 16th century jurist Muhammad al-Qastalani, died 1517, who in his well-known text Mawahib al-Dunya had proclaimed, and I quote, "The existence of an act in the Prophet's practice indicates its permissibility, but the non-existence of an act does not indicate its impermissibility. الفعل يدل على الجواز وعدم الفعل لا يدل على المنع." So Khan accused his Deobandi rivals of falsifying divine law by prohibiting practices that were permissible in essence. According to Khan, by prohibiting practices that God had not prohibited, Deoband scholars were playing God and altering the logic of divine normativity. Therefore, Khan argued the supposed Deobandi passion for restoring divine sovereignty was nothing but a farce. For in the guise of protecting divine sovereignty, they themselves were committing the heresy of tampering with divine law. As Khan sarcastically protested, addressing his Deoband rivals, this time in Persian, "Is the Sharia your household business that you may twist and play with whenever you so wish? Shariat kare khanagi shmas ke harjun khawhid pahlu gardani?" What can one even say to such warped jurisprudence? He bemoaned, dripping with sarcasm. "In tahakkum mein bejara chi gufta ayad." Apart from his hermeneutical disagreement, Khan's major complaint against his Deobandi opponents was the way they understood the interaction of tradition and time. According to Khan, the Deoband scholars held a very restricted and hence mistaken view of sacred time. As he put it, all of them suffer from the disease of making time the ultimate sovereign on the boundaries of normativity. Zaman ko hakim shar'i banaya hai. Their only concern is whether a practice existed during a certain period in history, the era of the Prophet and his companions, the first 3 generations, or not. As Khan put it while parodying the Deobandi position, if a practice existed during that era, they will endorse it. If it did not, they will outlaw it. As a counterpoint to such a temporally driven hermeneutic, Khan argued that the normative validity of an act depended on its inherent goodness or lack thereof, not on the period in history in which it occurred. A good act was good whenever it may be undertaken. Similarly, a bad act, regardless of when it happened, was bad. Instead of evaluating the inherent quality of a practice, Khan regretted, his Deoband opponents were only interested in determining whether it occurred during the first 3 generations of Islam, Qurun al-Thalatha, or not. A hermeneutic so fixated with an original sacred time was bound to produce a very myopic understanding of tradition, Khan argued. Now, no doubt, he agreed, the era of the Prophet, his companions, and their successors was most exemplary and sanctified. There was no doubt about that. However, and this was the most crucial point, the sanctity of prophetic time did not mean that the rest of time, the non-prophetic past, the present, and the future were doomed to the abyss of moral failure. Goodness was not restricted to any specific time period, not even to the first generation of Muslims. Khan punctuated his argument by citing the evocative saying of Prophet Muhammad, which goes like this: "My community is like rain. One cannot tell whether the beginning of a rain shower is better or its end. مثل أمتي مثل المطر لا يدرى أوله خير أم آخره." For Khan, this prophetic saying clearly showed that the horizon of goodness was not limited to any single temporal moment. The memory of an exemplary prophetic time was supposed to inspire the moral capacities of those who inhabited the present, not cripple them with the anxiety of living in the shadow of an irrecoverable past. Khan vividly sketched his understanding of the relationship between time and tradition through the metaphor of a garden, a small extract of which is on your handout. Islam, he analogized, was Muhammad's garden, a garden that continues to grow in splendor and magnificence over time. The original curators of the garden laid the foundational soil that ensured its capacity to survive during its fledgling years. However, they did not have the time or the opportunity to develop it any further. But gradually the garden blossomed. It became luscious green, blanketed with breathtaking flowers, the leaves and fountains, as each generation of scholars and saints added new layers of beauty to what they had inherited from their predecessors. Khan argued that tradition, like a blooming garden, represents a palimpsest of temporalities and thought styles, bound by a shared narrative of the moral good. Moreover, just like new varieties of flowers in a garden remain anchored to its original roots, new practices that are essentially good seamlessly connect with the logic of the Prophet's normative example, the Sunnah. Someone who objects to a pious practice because it did not exist during the first generations of Islam is as senseless as someone who denies the beauty of new flowers in a garden. Ultimately, Khan declared, and I quote him, "Such an ignorant fool will remain deprived of the garden's fruits and flowers." Let me conclude by returning to and deepening the central argument of this talk regarding approaching the Deobandi-Barelvi polemic, or perhaps other such polemics, as a reflection of competing political theologies. The opposing normative programs advanced by Barelvi and Deobandi pioneers mapped onto competing political logics and assumptions. Even though those logics and assumptions were not explicitly articulated as such. By political, I mean into a world of chaos and corruption, the sanitizing portion of divine normativity. In terms of the boundaries of religion then, religion in such a worldview existed outside the unstable contingencies of the social. The dictates of religion came from a sovereign source beyond the messiness of history. Religion represented an abstracted ideal of divine power and prophetic time that impinged on the world through the agency of moral people. Ahmad Raza Khan and his Barelvi followers shared many aspects of this worldview. He too was deeply suspicious of the masses and of their capacity to lead moral lives. He was no populist, but rather a die-in-the-wool elite scholar. However, in his thought, one finds much greater allowance for not divorcing the individual from the social context in which he or she operated. Most crucially, despite all the corruptions in society, it was precisely the ritual life of a community, made up of practices such as the celebration of the Prophet's birthday or transmitting blessings to the deceased through distributing food, that kept alive the Prophet's memory. It was through human engagement with the social that the Prophet's nobility and exceptional status was publicly marked, enacted, affirmed, performed. At the very end, in my talk today, I should mention that by shifting the conceptual focus to political theology, I've also sought to show that what may look like arcane intra-Muslim scholarly debates were in fact embedded in crucial questions of power, theology, law, and ritual, were entangled in profound anxieties and aspirations over massive questions of sovereignty, prophetic authority, law, and temporality. Analytically, this has involved an exercise in asking of authoritative religious actors from the past questions they would have not asked of themselves, of connecting their thought to larger conceptual themes not always centrally visible in the problem space in which they operated. Such an approach promises, I would argue, the dual dividend of adding depth and complexity to our knowledge of Islam as a discursive tradition, while also engaging that tradition in a contrapuntal encounter with theoretical conversations and interventions in religious studies and in the humanities more broadly. Thank you for your time.
Do they share the same assumptions on the evolutionary aspect of it? Is it divine creation? Is it like SherAli had his own theories of how things have evolved? So I wanted to hear more about that.
Sure. That's a great question. So in some ways, there are certain broader cosmological assumptions that are shared in this kind of intellectual milieu. I think your question also points to the important reminder of the kind of epistemic neighborliness between these kinds of scholars whom I was talking about. They share many assumptions in terms of common legal text, a common shared history, a common set of norms to which they go to when they engage in a debate. At least the kinds of normative universe that is being drawn is very much shared, whereas if you go a bit further in terms of other groups of scholars, those very assumptions in terms of the text that they're drawn or the hermeneutics that they bring to the text can change significantly. For example, these are two Hanafi groups of Hanafi scholars, whereas if you look at the non-conformist Ahl Hadith school in the 19th century, they have a very different kind of hermeneutic to think about tradition. And then if you go a bit further to look at scholars such as your interest in Sayyid Ahmad Khan, etc., they have a whole different kind of a cosmology and set of interests. So there are certain shared assumptions, but what I'm trying to show is that those very assumptions also can subtly but importantly shift in this shift from the 18th to the 19th century. So that even if there are groups of scholars who are sharing certain kinds of broader epistemic assumptions about what sources to go to, what hermeneutics to employ, they can arrive at completely different and radical results. But I do think that if one looks at it cross-temporally from even the late 18th to the late 19th century, even those shared assumptions are going through an important shift, and that's what I tried to show with that shift in the category of rasam, for example, or custom. And it's so basically the main shift was to conclude this answer that in Waliullah that category is very much tied to a broader cosmological concern about how a certain kind of a cosmological order informs the piety of everyday life, informs the order of everyday life. Now that cosmology continues in the thought of, say, Deoband scholars or even Barelvi scholars and others, but they become much more invested explicitly in the practice of everyday life, explicitly in these everyday practices that have to do with religious rituals and non-religious rituals also, such that the whole concept of custom comes to be invested in the choreography of everyday life and practice. And that's a subtle but important shift that nonetheless happens if we look at the comparison from the late 18th to 19th centuries.
Another question, please?
Do I wait for the microphone or not?
I'll give it. You can have this, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. My question is about the category of political theology that you use. It seems to me that you performed a historical reading of the debate and a theoretical reading of Schmidt, right? Because if you read Schmidt historically, you would also have to think about the historical context of loss of sovereignties that brought about, precisely similarly as your historical material, that brought about this categorization of political theology. So, and it seems to me in the debate, the first school that you discussed, that term applies in a way because of the corruption of the world, and in the second set of debates, precisely political theology is not the operative term, precisely because it seems to me what you did was to show that in the second debate, you have a logic of the world that is independent of the logic of the divine. There's divine time and perfection, and there is the worldly corruption. So precisely what doesn't collapse, which is precisely what Schmidt says, is the theologization of the political. So I guess I'm asking, how does one hold on to the notion of discursive tradition, which is within which concepts are internal to the tradition, and use a concept like political theology very much from the outside of the tradition to interrogate the movements of the tradition? Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much. So there are two sets of questions in that. Excellent set of questioning there. So in terms of the first question about the very category of political theology and how it's operating here, so you're correct, of course. Schmidt's observations and writings also come in a particular historical context, and one that I'm aware of. My attempt here was to open up this question in relation to the study of Islam, of how we might think about, not so much thinking about the ways in which sort of secular political imaginaries and the modern state is indebted to a certain notion of theology, but what if one were to invert that whole question to look at the kinds of political assumptions and normative imaginaries that are implicitly invested in seemingly theological debates and questions. So in some ways, trying to think about this category not from the vantage point of thinking about theological foundations of the secular state, but rather in terms of ways in which there are implicit political aspirations that might be sensed in these theological debates in terms of the way in which they conceptualize the relationship between the human and the divine, and how do they then mirror certain notions of a sort of a radically horizontal encounter of the human and the divine, which does not have as much of a place for hierarchies, and then other forms of imagined ways of imagining that encounter, which is deeply hierarchical, where you see a certain investment and a certain desire to hold on to an earlier monarchical understanding of politics. So, one of the largest sort of aspects of the political context of these kinds of affairs is that these debates around the prophet, to do with prophetic intercession, or to do with innovation in the prophet's practice, or to do with God's capacity to produce another prophet, etc. Implicitly in these debates, you see alternate political imaginaries at work. So that the very idea that something like prophetic intercession could be challenged, or the very idea that the role of these hierarchies could be challenged, came about and became popularized in the new conditions of colonial modernity. So in some ways, the first school that I mentioned, the Deoband school, is very much a beneficiary of that space in which even bringing up the possibility of a non-hierarchical human-divine encounter became much more popularized. And this is not a new concept, of course. It had been around for some time, but the kind of currency it took was there was something new about it. So that's the kind of way in which I'm trying to invert that category by employing it in this particular context. In terms of the second question about the applicability of political theology to the second school, so that exactly to tie to what I was just saying. So in some ways, the way in which, for example, an idea like heretical innovation is being talked about is deeply invested in holding on to an earlier monarchical understanding of society, an earlier hierarchical notion of life, in which the human-divine encounter can only be imagined in the form of a strictly regulated hierarchy, through which an older moment which has been eroded, a moment of sort of a pre-colonial understanding of politics, is being harkened, is being evoked, but through the language of theology. So that kind of syncopation between the political and the theological is what I'm getting at in terms of the kind of political theology that is at work here. So in some ways, it might not always mirror, it might not always fully map onto the way in which Schmidt imagined this category, but in some ways my attempt is to sort of be inspired by that whole discussion and conversation in the field of religion and sort of cognate fields, law, anthropology and so on, but to then employ it in ways that would be most useful to these set of actors, to make some theoretical space in terms of trying to make sense of them beyond just explaining the theological points and arguments, but thinking about or speculating at least on the larger political imaginaries that were invested in these kinds of debates. So in some ways it's a colonization of the theory to open up new theoretical space in terms of thinking about these actors and their discourses.
Well, I was wondering how we can understand the close relationship between maybe the Deobandi movement and the Tabligh Jamaat movement, especially in light of the characterization of Deobandis situating good temporally and perhaps being suspicious of or even criminalizing practices that emerged after the first 3 generations. How do they reconcile, or how can we understand this?
So the transnational evangelical Tabligh Jamaat movement, of course, is very much indebted to the Deoband universe and is very much comes from that universe. And oftentimes the way in which the two movements are distinguished in even serious academic scholarship is that Tabligh Jamaat is oftentimes described as the quietist, the non-political movement which is invested in moral reform, which is invested in the reform of the body and a certain kind of a sort of harnessing of biased subjects without engaging explicitly in electoral politics and so on. So one of the problems in that kind of a distinction between apolitical quietism and political reform is that that kind of a distinction does not take into account the very politics invested in the whole idea of reforming the religious subject, or reform through the cultivation of moral bodies. That is a deeply political act, right? That kind of so one of the sort of ways in which in the seminal work on the Deoband movement, of course, is the great work by Barbara Metcalfe on the Deoband movement. But of course, the claim that she makes, the argument that she makes is that Deoband, or these kinds of movements in the 19th century, are reflected by what she called an inward turn, where increasingly these Muslim reformers thought more about the matters of the individual body or the regulation of moral communities, and not so much about politics and electoral politics and so on. The problem with that kind of an argument is precisely that it is operative on a very restricted view of what is the political, and does not take into account in some ways to invoke and to celebrate the argument, the seminal argument of anthropologist Sabah Mahmood, the politics of piety, the politics of the cultivation of certain kinds of bodies, and through that certain notions of moral publics. But the thought styles are different between Tabligh Jamaat and the Deoband school. They would be much less prone to engaging in these kinds of polemics and debates when it comes to the boundaries of normativity. But both of these schools are nonetheless animated by a common project of imagining the Prophet in a certain way, emphasizing the humanity of the Prophet, and through the Prophet imagining new notions of the public sphere. So in some ways that's one thing that I'm getting at through this, the title, Defending Muhammad in Modernity, of how competing understandings of Muhammad map onto competing notions of a moral public sphere, and competing understandings of reform, and competing understandings of how the Prophet interacts with the divine sovereign, and the implications of that God-Prophet relationship to the choreography of everyday life. So that nexus between law, theology, and everyday practice is what I'm trying to get at with this idea of competing political theologies or competing understandings of the Prophet in modernity.
Thank you. This is very thought-provoking. I think I agree with you generally that the political does map onto the theological in certain ways, but I guess I'm not so sure if custom is necessarily the way to get at that. and the concept of bid'ah, because from what I and out. So I guess my question is, bid'ah and custom had been challenged prior to the 19th century, and I'm thinking of works like Reem Mash'al and Custom and the Making of the Modern Egyptian, in which she argues in instances an example of Rusum exactly that was brought about in the 16th century, and people like Ibn Nujaym argued against it because on the grounds of bid'ah. And even if you go way back to the initial madhahibs and the Maliki school and the custom, how it worked in was part and parcel of the creation of the Sharia itself. So I guess my question to you is, what was unique about custom in the 19th century in India that made it sort of a site for the negotiation between the political and the theological? I guess that's my first comment on your argument. And then my second argument was sort of to push back on some of your own interlocutors. I guess it's the first school, which and you focus a lot on the I would guess the ibadat or whatnot. But if you look at the world that I engage in mostly, which is the world of crime and criminal law, and in that case, the state had always sort of had a role to, one would say, innovate, and the fuqaha sort of were kind of silent about it. Mawardi has written about this, and Ahkam al-Sultaniyya and others. So my sense is that throughout Islamic history there was always some kind of innovation taking place, and so if their argument is about going back in time to the time of the Prophet and to see what the Prophet was doing, I would say we could always see that there was innovation, even going back to the Prophet's time, and that there were things that humans had to do that didn't defy God's authority, just because they had to do it. And so I'm not so sure if there had been pushback by Ahmad Reza Khan to them, not just on the question of time, but just on their own challenges to the hubris that sort of comes about from their notion of bid'ah.
Sure. So, thank you so much, Mina, for those great questions. Let me say three brief comments that should hopefully somewhat address these questions. First question about what was so peculiar about the late 19th century and this idea of customs and rusum and so on. The main shift that happens in the late 19th century in South Asian context is that these practices of everyday life become objects of contestation in a manner which is unprecedented. The main distinction that you find between, and you're absolutely correct that these are not conversations which are new or peculiar to the South Asian context. The very idea that that bid'ah is basically those practices in religion or innovations in religion which simulate the Sharia has a much longer genealogy. The great Maliki, the jurist Shatibi in his Al-I'tisam has precisely this definition of bid'ah. So it has a much longer genealogy. What happens in the late 19th century, one clear rupture that we see is that the number of practices that come under the scope of critique, that become objects of contestation, ranging not only from devotional practices like, say, the celebration of the Prophet's birthday, but also things like kite flying or other in terms of wedding ceremonies, engagement ceremonies, kite flying, what you do with the hair and the body and so on, comportment, dress, etc. The very lines between devotional and non-devotional, or the religious and the non-religious, become increasingly blurry, because the whole argument which is oftentimes employed is when a non-religious practice is done with such regularity and passion that it begins to simulate devotional practices. When that's line of argument, then it makes that line quite blurry, precisely between devotional and non-devotional. So that is what makes the late 19th century context and its engagement with custom in South Asia different from the earlier moments. The number of practices that come under discussion, the intensity of the polemics, and the way in which everyday life becomes a subject of contestation among the Muslim scholarly elite. So if the 18th and 17th century texts on bid'ah that you find in the South Asian context, you don't find this level of contestation on these practices of everyday life. And one major reason why this happens is also the emergence of print, and most of these texts become in the form of sort of short sort of tracts which are written. I mean, they really vary in terms of their degree to which they're for expert audiences and then for sort of more the masses. So that's the first question. In response to the second question about the state, the paradoxical thing that happens is that with the Queen's proclamation that you have this evacuation of this sphere, this domain of religious debate and contestation. All religions and all religious communities can debate and engage in all these contestations as long as they don't impinge on, as long as they don't confront the sovereignty of the state. In fact, the British even organized polemical festivals, which is a part of my second book project. Colonial sort of officials organizing polemical festivals where they bring together these Muslim scholars, the founder of the Hindu reform movement, the Arya Samaj, Dayanand Saraswati, and Christian missionaries. We give you chairs, we'll give you all the support, the police will be there, and you debate your religion for 4 days. And this was a show of the commitment of the British state to pluralism and interreligious debate, and oftentimes they got too hostile and they had to clamp it down. So that's a paradoxical idea, that this evacuation of the sphere of religious debate ends up making that sphere that much more contentious. So in some ways that makes it possible for these kinds of actors to make these kinds of legal innovations also. So many of these things that they're doing some very creative legal work that sometimes border on transgressing or border on really doing things which don't have a precedent in the tradition, and doing it quite confidently. And that's one of the other major counter-arguments that the Barelvi school, the Ahmad Reza Khan, uses against the Deoband school, that there is a long tradition of scholars from the medieval period to the early modern period in the Hanafi school, in other schools, who have sanctioned these practices that you're outlawing today. So who gives you the authority, come the late 19th century, besides this hubris that you're mentioning, of outlawing these practices and going against this entire tradition? And the Deobandi response to that question is that if these scholars knew what we know about Indian Muslims today, they would also have critical knowledge about the practice of the masses. And it becomes the whole question of, are the masses undermining divine sovereignty in the manner in which they're engaging in these practices? And the last point I will make here is that even the Barelvi school, Ahmad Reza Khan, they don't have a charitable view of the masses. They agree that the masses are engaging in all kinds of corruption. But the subtle legal argument here is that when simply permissible practices, the mubahat, become corrupted in the intention with which the masses are engaging in such practices, what do you do in that situation? For the Deoband school, you completely outlaw those practices at that moment, so that you cut the means to further corruption. Whereas for the Barelvi school, you engage in the pedagogy and moral rectification of the practices of the masses. You don't completely outlaw practices that are a means to venerate the Prophet. That's the subtle legal debate and sort of point of distinction between the two schools. And the point I'm trying to make is that this subtle legal reasoning that is going on, as much as it sort of creatively plays with earlier precedents and so on, cannot be mapped onto a debate between the mystics and the Sharia-minded scholars, or between law and Sufism, which is oftentimes the way in which this debate has been approached. And that's the kind of approach that I'm trying to question through this kind of theorization. So in some ways I've touched on some of your questions.
Thank you. That's all we have time for today, unfortunately, even though I would love to go on with these questions.